Good morning. Welcome to the day's Bible study. Welcome to our online folks and our nice big group of in-person folks as well. Thanks to Carrie for today's snacks, and later we'll have our prayer following our Bible study. If you will bow your heads in a short opening prayer here. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the rain that we got last night, but be with any of the victims of the tornadoes that were displaced or lost property or valuables. As always, we praise your name that we can come together and study your word. And we thank you so much for our ability to do that. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right, good morning and welcome. Welcome back to our study on Daniel. We're post-spring break now, and we're in an in-between week because we have a lesson this week, and then next week will be a service day, and then we'll follow up with our the rest of our lessons through our final chapters. So, Mary, you're frowning. Is that wrong? Okay, just checking because sometimes I have it wrong. Well, I didn't have the best markers, but I tried. All right. So today we are in lesson 8, Daniel's dream, which is over chapter 7. But let's go back, 2 weeks ago, to our lesson on Daniel in the lion's pit. What did we learn? What spoke to you or is a lasting point from the lesson of Daniel in the lion's pit?
Daniel's consistency in his worship of God and putting God first, his priorities.
Okay, Daniel. She said Daniel's consistency in his worship of God, his putting God first, his prayer, his priorities. Yeah, and we saw that Daniel was an old man by this time, right? This has been, the decades have gone by, kings have come and gone, and Daniel is still there. Yeah. Carrie.
God is faithful to his followers, to his people. He comes through and he protects them. So in response to what they're doing, he is always there too.
Yeah, God's faithfulness to his followers, God's consistency as well. You know, he was there and he protected Daniel in Daniel's faithfulness. Daniel says he was found innocent in God's eyes, and so we see God's protection of his people. Yeah. Which is a major theme of the book, right? Yeah. Be faithful as God's servant. God is faithful to you. Yeah. What else?
These kings don't really ever listen and don't really ever come through.
The kings don't listen.
They're very fickle.
They're fickle because they are driven by their own arrogance and self-indulgence, and we see that running through, right? So that in this case, it was the king was foolish, and the ministers or other sages were petty. And we see this kind of behavior that goes against God from all of these people all the way through. Yeah. And it lasts a time and trials happen. And Daniel went all the way into the lion's pit and spent the whole night with the lions. He wasn't rescued away from the trial, but he was attended to by God in the trial. God with him.
You actually have the opposites. You have Daniel putting God first, and you have all the kings and all these other men putting themselves and their wishes first.
Yeah.
And shows the outcome.
Yeah, the outcome of all of these the ministers, the kings, all the tattletale, everyone who is opposing God and opposing God's people. God is still in charge in the end. And we saw Daniel in the pit with the stone and the seal, and we saw how that was an echo, a pre-echo of Jesus to come. That Jesus's self-sacrifice and his being lifted up out of his death into victory, shows that God is with us in trial, and God himself suffers along with us to win victory over sin and death. Yeah. So today we're in chapter 7. So let's begin by reading verses 1 through 12. And Haley, could I impose on you to read those first 12 verses?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Daniel's dream of
Thank
four
you.
beasts. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of it. Daniel said, "In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven, churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time."
Thank you. Okay, so where are we we begin with a chronological note, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where are we in our time progression?
In the first year of Belshazzar.
Okay, first year of Belshazzar, right? So is that where we ended the last chapter?
No, going back
we were
back to the, what chapter was it? 5 or 3?
Yeah, where will we put this chapter-wise, chronologically?
It happened before chapter 5.
Okay, so this would fall, if we were going to reorder chronologically, which we don't do because the ordering is done for literary reasons, right? But it would fall chronologically between chapter 4 and chapter 5, right? Before the end of Belshazzar's reign in chapter 5, but after the Nebuchadnezzar's events in chapter 4. So why do we have it in chapter 6? Why is it after chapter, Belshazzar already died and now we're back in the reign of Belshazzar? Why? First year of the reign. And we remember that his reign is kind of a, we have to put our quotes around reign, right? It's, he was a regent, not a king. And yet he had about 10 years where he was the power, reigning in Babylon. So it's probably the first of that 10-year period where his father was absent and he was regent. So why do we put it after chapter 6 instead?
Or if they try to pair up I don't know what you call it, but everything's been paired up.
Right. Okay, so Pam says the chiastic structure is the name of it. So Pam says everything has been paired, right? So it went A, B, C, C, B, A when we did chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So what we're doing is completing that chiastic structure. And what is the pairing? What is paired with chapter 6? We're consulting notes.
Is it 3?
Okay, so 3 is the story of the friends in the fiery furnace,
Yeah.
right?
So 4?
Daniel's dream matches up with the king's dream, right? It would be chapter 2, right? So Nebuchadnezzar's dream, chapter 2, matches up with Daniel's dream, chapter 7. So those two, the fiery furnace matches up with the lion's pit, and the two kings being humbled. Nebuchadnezzar, it receives the mind of the beast, and Belshazzar and the writing on the wall. Those are paired. So we've completed our structure. So this is a literary arrangement, isn't it? They're saying something where we can see that these are supposed to be parallel because all these chapters have had parallels. Okay, why else?
We moved into a different genre.
Okay.
The chapters before were historical, and now we start into the prophecy.
Okay, so Mary says we've moved into a different genre. The chapters before were historical, and now we move into prophecy. Okay. That is one view. And it was well stated, and so we can see that there's some truth to that, right? Because we got all those court stories. 1 through 6 are all these narrative dramas of these, events playing out in the king's court, right? And then now, chapter 7, we begin these visions, right? The strange visions is what begins in chapter 7. It continues all the way through the end of 12. So, so we have sort of like subgenres, like the court stories and the visions. But the whole book has also made an effort to tie itself together, right? Don't we have connections? So this story is a hinge that begins these visions, but it also harkens back to chapter 2, which was a court story with these parallel dreams, right? So these are not, I like the way you said that. I'm going to qualify that I don't think these are completely separate genres. In some sense, they're separate genres. In the other ways, we have all apocalyptic content that is very intentionally woven together. And we can see those pieces, we'll see all the same words that we've been seeing: dominion, sovereignty. Those have come up over and over. They come up again today. They're all tied together. Questions or comments on that?
This reads like Revelation almost.
Okay, it reads like Revelation. Why is that?
It's apocalyptic.
It's apocalyptic, exactly. The piece of apocalyptic literature that we have in the New Testament is Revelation. Revelation is the same genre, and so that's why even in these dreams like the cosmic tree and the statue with 4 parts, we get all these elements, these same apocalyptic elements are running through. And so Revelation is not only is apocalyptic literature, similar style of writing, but it intentionally grabs what's in Daniel and pulls it forward, right? Who's the bad guy? The name of the bad guy in Revelation? The empire, that is the evil empire in Revelation?
The Antichrist.
Okay, they talk about the Antichrist. Very often they name an empire.
Roman?
Well, okay, so when we read it, we go, this is probably about the Roman Empire, but they don't call it Rome, they call it Babylon.
Oh,
Is there any Babylonian Empire in the time of Revelation is written?
I don't know.
Long gone. But they're drawing on these same ideas, right? These are all tied together. Babylon becomes kind of the name of the bad guy of the empire that sets itself up against God from the Tower of Babylon all the way through Revelation, right? Beginning to end. All right. So we have chapter 7 as a hinge. And we talked about this in the introduction, but tell me, is chapter 7 written, what person is it written in? For third person or first person?
Most of it in the first. Yeah.
Okay, I got a first. I have another.
I saw.
I saw.
I looked.
Okay, let's read verse 1 again.
Yep.
In the first year of King Belshazzar, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed, and he wrote down the substance of the dream. What person is that?
That's third.
That's third.
But mine says a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first.
In verse 2?
One.
Okay, you have a King James.
Uh-huh.
It's the translation, I think that's a translation thing. It should be third in verse 1. So the idea is like he starts speaking in first person, but it's a quote, right? Our translations put it in quotes, right? And so there's sort of this sense of like, is this because Daniel, original captive of Nebuchadnezzar, wrote it himself? Or is it because it's presented in his voice, as is common in apocalyptic literature? And it could be either, and either would be appropriate to the genre. Either the final compiler of Daniel had material from the person Daniel and used it, or it is written as apocalyptic literature often is, in his voice, because it tells us something about the worthiness of the vision. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so tell me about the scene, but let's look at verses 2 and 3. What scene is set and what is happening?
There's the four winds that are churning up the sea.
The four winds are churning up the sea. Okay, what does the sea mean? So that's the question we want to think about as we look across scripture. Turn to
Multitude, people,
okay.
tongues.
There's one idea, is a multitude of people. Other ideas? Let's turn to Genesis 1:1. Okay. So first scene, page 1 of the Bible, right? First scene of scripture. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Haven't we been drawing on that idea? The cosmic tree, its branches were to heaven and its roots were in earth, right? The heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and void, or these are the words in Hebrew, tohu and bohu, wild and waste. This is a sense of nothingness, wild and waste, tohu and bohu, formless and void. And darkness was over the surface of the deep. Now the word for deep here is tahom, and this is a word for the primordial sea or the abyss, right? This is the word for the chaos waters. And we see that the Spirit of God, or the Ruach, which is same word for spirit, wind, or breath. Spirit, wind, and breath all use the word Ruach. And the Ruach of God is hovering over the surface of the waters. Okay. This is the scene presented to us, the first creation moment. Right? And when we read this, we need to transition our thinking away from a modern conception of creation, right? We tend to think of creation of the bringing into existence of matter. Everything's made of matter. Even the air is made of matter, right? That's how we think of creation and existence. And we think of nothingness as the absence of matter. Like there's no molecules there, so there's nothing, right? We have a scientific mindset. That is our cosmology. But the ancient mind did not have a concept of everything being made of matter, right? You can imagine that like, why would they have a concept of everything being made of matter? And instead, and so they didn't have the concept of nothingness being the absence of matter like we do. Instead, nothingness was the concept of chaos, the absence of order. Not the absence of matter, but the absence of order. That's what nothingness is in this cosmology as it's presented to us in Genesis 1. That's why formless, without form, without order, wild, chaotic, by formless and void go together, because the the uncreated world is a place of chaos. And the source or the location or the essence of chaos is the Tehom. It's the deep, it's the great chaos sea, the chaos waters. And this idea of chaos waters runs all the way through scriptures. We'll see it again and again. When in the Noah and the flood story, it's the Tehom that is unleashed on the world and causes the flood. It talks about the floodgates of the heavens, right? We don't think of there being any water up there, right? I mean, there's some moisture in the atmosphere. Last night, maybe it felt like the Tehom was unleashed on us, right? As we had the storms, but we don't think of it. That's how they thought of it. The floodgates of the heavens, the doors in the heavens are open and the Tehom descends and it causes the flood. And so this idea of chaos waters shows up in multiple ancient understandings of what the world is. And in fact, the word Tehom is cognate with someone called Tiamat. This is the Babylonian chaos goddess or monster. She's a chaos monster. She is a goddess, but she's also a chaos monster, Tiamat. And in the Babylonian creation epic, which is called the Enuma Elish, and I've written it up here because it took me a long time to understand the letters that people were saying when they were saying Enuma Elish, and it is available in full online. If you want to go read it, you can in translated form. The Babylonian creation epic, Enuma Elish. The god Marduk battles Tiamat, the chaos monster, right? There is a violent fight. And in this battle, the way he subdues her is he directs the four winds into her mouth, and it holds her mouth open, and he shoots an arrow down through her mouth and throat, being held open by the four winds, into her heart, killing her, and then tears her in half, and her two halves become the earth and the heaven, the earth below and the heaven above. So thinking about, okay, I heard a whisper, and I'm going to out it because it's perfect. I like our version better. That's exactly the point of Genesis 1, is to rebut the Babylonian. This is written with an understanding of what the Babylonians believed creation was. And so that's why you have all these little points of like ping, 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 the winds, the deep, the chaos, the formlessness. And so the biblical creation story refutes many ideas of the Babylonians about creation and about who God is and about the nature of our world, right? God doesn't have to subdue. There's no battle. There is no violence of God versus God. Instead of an uncontrolled wind over the primordial sea, there's just the ruach. The Spirit of God is hovering over the primordial sea, and he creates or orders the chaos with just a word. And so our creation story says something completely different than the Babylonian creation story, while meeting it on these little pings, right? Little points of drawing on the understanding of ancient cosmology. So, return to our scene in Daniel, right? Now, what does the great sea symbolize?
Chaos. I mean,
Chaos. Exactly. The chaos waters, right? It symbolizes the destructive forces, the home that breaks into the world. I missed saying this before. I'm going to say this because this is cool. The idea of those chaos waters running all the way through Scripture, we get it all over the Psalms, right? God is defeating the Leviathan, the Rahab. There's always that idea of God is master over the chaos waters, right? Who else is master over the sea? The winds and the waves obey him.
Jesus.
Yes, that is drawing on the concept of the waters as a source of chaos and anti-creation. And Jesus being the master of them means so much, right? It means more than just he can control the weather, right? He's master over the uncreation forces. In Revelation, the great throne room scenes in Revelation, there is a sea that is like glass or crystal, right? All the chaos is out of it. Revelation 4:6. Before the throne, there was, as it were, a sea of glass, like crystal. In Revelation 15:2, I saw what appeared to be a sea of glass mingled with fire, right? Our God is a consuming fire. When God is present, we often see fire. We'll talk about that more. And in the new heaven and the new earth, in Revelation 21:1, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there was no longer any sea, right? Nobody's against, whales there. That's not about being opposed to ocean life, right? That's about like the chaos waters are gone in the new creation. It's complete. Creation is completely under the will of God. No more chaos, no longer any sea. So we have these chaos waters. So back to Daniel. We took a long detour there through ancient cosmology. And there's so much more that's a fascinating subject. And we may be able to get into it again. I don't know. What is making them more chaotic, churning them up? Okay, before that, the winds. Why four? Why are there four winds?
Because north, south, east, and west.
It's the compass directions, right? It's the winds from every direction, the compass points. And instead of a hovering spirit, now we have the violence of the winds, and they're churning up a sea. And this is like a battle. Not like at creation. Instead, we have a time of chaos and violence. And what is the result of this time of chaos and violence? But the beasts, right? These beasts, four great beasts emerge from the sea. What are their general characteristics?
They're animals.
Powerful.
Okay, powerful. Are they animals?
Well, they're described as appearing to look like animals.
They're like animals, right? Features.
And they're kind of mixed features.
Okay, they're composite, right? These are composite beings. We talked about how composite creatures were very often a portrayal of the divine beings, beings of the heavenly court, right? Composite. So we see that these are like animals, but they aren't merely earthly because they have some of the qualities that we see in otherworldly beings. And you said they're powerful. What else are they like? Powerful in a good way?
No.
Scary.
Scary, right? They are scary. They're violent, they're destructive, right? And they culminate in arrogance. So, you know, if we were to try to draw these guys, we might come up with cartoons, right? But is this what's the tone here? Is the tone a light tone? It's terrifying, isn't it? Right? These beasts are monstrous. They're, you know, this is Daniel saying, I had a dream. I was surrounded by man-eating beasts, right? This is a terrifying scene.
And when I think of a lion and an eagle, I think of the power.
Okay.
They're powerful animals. I mean, when you think of how they live and how they live and how they hunt and stuff for their food, to me, that's very powerful. The wings of an eagle, to me, are power. A lion, to me, expresses power, powerful.
Right. What do we call a lion?
King
Of beasts, right? That's our expression, but I think it carries over, right? That power. You said the sort of the most exalted beast is a lion, and the most exalted bird is an eagle, right? These majestic beasts. And so, let's think about what are we expecting these beasts to represent. Turn over to verse 15. We're back we're going to preview the interpretation of the dream so that as we go through the four beasts, we can talk about their description as it appears in the original telling of the vision and in the interpretation, because the information goes together. Verse 15, I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, right? This is frightening. And the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me, and I approached one of those standing there. This is someone in the heavenly court, right? Like an angelic being. And asked him the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth. Now, does he mean the earth, not the sea? He means the earth, not heaven, right? This is the contrast, earth. So this goes with them coming out of the sea, right? Earthly, chaotic, not from heaven. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Okay, the first layer of interpretation is very short. So the four great beasts represent these four kingdoms. And if there's a vision with four things that represent four kingdoms, what is this reminding us of? The statue in chapter 2, our parallel chapter, right? Nebuchadnezzar's dream, the statue of the four metals. So who is the first kingdom? Babylon. This makes sense, right? The most exalted beast, the most exalted bird is matching up with what part of the statue?
The head.
The golden head, right? The head. And so this is like, okay, we understand this part of the vision is about Nebuchadnezzar / Babylon, right? What happens to the lion / eagle monster?
Its wings go away, and then it stands up.
Okay, its wings are defeathered, plucked. Not some versions will say torn off, but it's more like if you pluck a chicken, you don't tear off its wings, you take off its feathers, right? Its wings are plucked, the feathers are removed, it stands up, and then what?
It has the mind of a man.
It's given the mind or the heart, same word, leb. It's the seat of the will and the mind and the emotions in ancient thinking. So the heart, it's given the heart or the mind of a man, right? Okay, three things. What is this like?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Okay, how is it like Nebuchadnezzar?
He was humbled because he became like a wild beast.
Yes.
And then he was returned to his right mind, and he was able to rule after that in humble allegiance
recognizing that God has done it.
Right. Okay. So exactly. Daniel 4:33. Immediately the word concerning Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, and he was driven away from mankind, and he began eating grass like cattle. Is he standing up? No, he's bent down. And his body was drenched with the dew of heaven till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. Right? So we get this, like, when we take the understanding that this is the first kingdom, right? This is Nebuchadnezzar/Babylon. And we see the eagleness is being stripped away, and it's becoming back upright, and it's heart of a mind, or heart or mind of a man is given to it. This is like the reversal of God's judgment on Babylon, right? So Nebuchadnezzar was judged and became all these things. Later he was restored. But when we think about the kingdom of Babylon, yes, they were judged, but now it's chaos waters, it's the four winds, and we have a scene of the worldly monstrous forces being empowered, right? This is not good for the people who would be under these beastly rulers, right? They're being set up instead of taken down, right? In verse 5, we see the bear, right? Another predator, right? Another fierce, powerful animal. The bear may stand for media, depending on the sequence that you follow. And the bear has devoured. You can still see the ribs in its mouth. And it's given instruction. It's told, devour more. So this is like the lament psalms in a way, isn't it? Where we see, how long, O God, will evil continue to prosper? Where we're seeing the continued prospering of these monstrous oppressive beasts. Verse 6, the leopard could be Persia. What is its distinctive weirdness? 4 wings and 4 heads, right? Some scholars think these 4 wings and 4 heads might represent the 4 Persian kings known in Scripture. So that would be Cyrus, that we get in Ezra and Isaiah, Xerxes, that we get in Ezra and Esther, Artaxerxes in Ezra, and Darius the Persian in Nehemiah, if those are in fact supposed to represent 4 kings. But these 4 heads could also be like the 4 winds, right? Represent the 4 points of the compass, the universal rule. Because what is the leopard given? Dominion. It's given authority to rule. And so maybe this represents in every direction, right? The reign, the oppressive and monstrous and terrible reign of these beasts is just, it's continuing and it's being empowered. Okay. Questions on the first 3 beasts before we go on to the 4th beast?
Well, on the bear, it's lopsided. One
It is.
side is higher than the other, and the Persia took over the Edo.
Persia was stronger and defeated the Medes, and that may be what is indicated, but we see a sense of deformity in that characteristic, right? These beasts are monstrous. They are not, they aren't the classic specimens, right? They're terrible. Yeah. Other questions or comments?
Dan, I have this illustration in my Bible. It's a study Bible, NIV, and it has visions in Daniel, and it's broken down into the different chapters, but it's saying this section, the leopard, corresponds with Greece, according to this drawing or this illustration. So I just thought I'd throw that out there.
I have the same illustration. However, what that does is it places the 4th beast as Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is the case, which we did this when we talked about chapter 2, about those 4 kingdoms, how we can end with the 4th being Greece, or we can end with the 4th being Rome, are 2 options of ways to understand this. If we end with it being Rome, then we don't really have a person to call the little horn. So most scholars, most scholars tell us that these, okay, let's do that. Let's come back to that when we get to.
Sorry.
No, it's really hard to do this chapter in order because it's all intermeshed, right? I struggled writing this
Yeah.
to try to figure out how to do that. So let's talk about the little horn, and then we'll try to help me remember to come back to that. What is different, verse 7, about the fourth beast?
Well, it's not described as looking like anything.
It doesn't look like anything,
It's
right?
terrifying.
It has no analog. It has no comparison. You can't, it's so terrible you can't even compare it to any animal. Yeah. What else?
It has 10 horns on the top.
Okay, these
and
horns.
iron teeth.
Okay, iron teeth. All right. So what do horns symbolize? Okay, power. A king is associated with a horn because a king blows the horn to assemble the people or call them to battle. But here the horns are distorted because they're not just a symbol of kingliness, they're also a symbol of the monstrosity of this beast, right? Okay, iron. What about why is iron mentioned here?
Well, it's in the statute, the legs of iron.
Okay, we're connected to chapter 2, the legs of iron and the feet, partly of iron and partly of clay, and the toes of, that goes, it mentions iron. So this idea of iron connects those. And just like in chapter 2, that regime was crushed the others. This beast is the most brutal, right? Other beasts have been somewhat passive in some ways, right? They have been lifted up. They have been made to stand. They have been told, they have been given, like someone else is empowering those other beasts. But this beast doesn't have any of those passive verbs, right? We have active verbs, right? It's crushing, right? What else is it doing?
Devouring.
Devouring. What else? Trampling, right? It's all these it's actively, independently destructive. So it is the most brutal, right? And we see.
Wasn't the Roman Empire the one that invented crucifixion?
Okay, the Roman Empire was deeply brutal, but then so was the Greek Empire. And so we have these elements of brutality that recur in these worldly kingdoms, right? And this idea that men become like beasts when they don't follow God's way is active in all of these symbols, right? Okay, so what happens? What happens with the horns?
Was 4 of them fall off?
Oh, one, there's another little horn that comes up, and then it knocks 3 of them by their roots out.
Okay, there's 10 horns, 3 get knocked out, and a little one comes up in their place. All right, let's read verses 19 through 26 out of the interpretation. Daniel was he's just really bothered by this little horn situation, right? It's like, this is the worst of the worst, right? Verse 19, then I wanted to know the true meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. See, all those verbs were worth repeating. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others and had eyes and a mouth, making it like a human, like a person, and spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints and the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. And he gave me this explanation. This is the divine being that Daniel had consulted in verse 15, right? He wanted to know more, and so the angel, part of the retinue of God in heaven, gives an explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on the earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms, right? It can't be compared. It doesn't have the analog. Trampling it down, and it will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. Our verbs again, right? The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue the 3 kings, and he will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and the laws. And the saints will be handed over to him for a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Okay, so what are the 10 horns? 10 kings or 10 kingdoms. And that word, you will get different translations because it's one letter different in Aramaic. And the Greek has one thing and the Aramaic has the other. And so you'll sometimes, the translators sort of vary on how they like to translate that. 10 kings or 10 kingdoms. Yet throughout the visions in Daniel's, we have seen kings and kingdoms kind of used interchangeably, haven't we? Scholars who think this beast represents Greece, which is most, we'll come back to the Rome idea, most think Greece, work really hard to identify these 10 kings that match the 10 horns. And they have a list and they exclude that guy because he had this, didn't have this thing, and he wasn't reigning at the same time. And then they come up with 10 kings. So it can be done. Somebody else's list might vary slightly. Okay. Well, yeah. So Carrie says, could it not just be a symbolic number? So when they do this, they come up with the 10 kings. Then they even have 3 kings that one king uprooted. And so what the narrowing point that most scholars think is that the little horn represents Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, a Greek king of the 2nd century BC, who is described in the stories in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And we're going to talk about him in future lessons in more detail, but I'll give you a summary. But could this be 10, like a whole amount of them? And it could be, and that's kind of what we would have to do if we're calling this Rome. If we call this Rome, we don't really have a figurehead of Antiochus Epiphanes. And as we go into chapter 8, am I in 7? Yes. Chapter 8, I really confused myself making the lessons being one off from the chapters, y'all. Yeah, sorry, but we had to have an introductory lesson. There was so much to say. So when we go into chapter 8, the details really nail it down like it's Antiochus Epiphanes, and they start naming the kingdoms even. And so if this follows the same scheme that we see in chapter 8, then this needs to be Greece. Now, does it have to follow the same scheme in chapter 8? It doesn't actually have to, right? Because we see the elements of human kingdoms, they just repeat. There's a reason John can call Rome Babylon, right? Because human kingdoms are beastly when they don't follow God's ways.
Mm-hmm.
What language is this chapter?
This chapter is still in Aramaic, okay. Right? We talked about it being a hinge. Those court stories that go A, B, C, C, B, A, those are the Aramaic. That's the Aramaic portion. So this is the final chapter of the Aramaic portion. So, and then it points to, and then you get the similar content as 7 in 8 through 12, but that goes back to Hebrew. Okay, so here's something about Antiochus Epiphanes. In the 2nd century BC, Antiochus IV showed extreme antipathy for the Jews. Antiochus pushed his program of Hellenization, forced conversion to the Greek culture, sold the high priesthood, to the highest bidder pretty much, and then to somebody else who was now a higher bidder and got rid of that guy. And it was bad. Sold the high priesthood, plundered the Jerusalem temple. Then he made Judaism illegal, intentionally desecrated the temple, and began to force the Jews to worship the Greek gods or die. And so this was an extreme level of persecution. And it appears that we're like, as this, as the scene is narrowing into this little horn, or, we have a different symbol for him in next chapter we'll talk about, that we're pointing towards Antiochus IV. We have a greatly arrogant and evil character who is deeply oppressive and who actively opposes God and God's people. Right? He will oppress God's people for a painful period. It says times and half a time. It's could be a way of saying 3.5 years, 1 time, 2 times, half a time. But we notice like he is a monster within a monster, right? He's a little horn on the head of this monstrous beast, right? He's a monster within a monster, but we also notice that he's little. Let's turn back to our first section. In verse 9, what happens next? Okay, thrones, yours says cast down? Oh, that's odd.
Thrones were cast down.
So I think that this is more commonly translated, thrones were set in place. Thrones were they were brought and put in place. And so we have thrones, and it's not just one throne for God, right? In the Babylonian pantheon, that would be all of their gods. But what we get is a scene of God and his court, right? The divine council. And who takes a seat? God himself, the Ancient of Days, right? This name would be similar to a Canaanite name used for their God, the Father of Years, who is portrayed as old and wise with gray hair. But we see the Ancient of Days, or the Eternal One, is what? What is he like?
His clothing is white as snow. Yeah. His head was white like wool.
Dazzling white, clothing and hair are dazzling white. What else?
His throne was flaming fiery flame.
Right.
And his wheels were all ablaze.
Right. Fire is associated with the holiness of God, right? The brilliant white and the fire, the burning bush. Yeah. What else? When else is fire associated with God?
When he leads them out of
The fiery, cloudy pillar as he leads them out of Egypt, right? He comes down on Mount Sinai, and there's the burning and the smoke and the ever-increasing trumpet blast, right? These are signs of the holiness of God. His throne has wheels, right? The Babylonian gods don't live among men. We can't ask them for the dream interpretation, but God is everywhere. He's with us. Right? And so we have this imagery that reveals God's power and holiness. And who is he attended by?
Thousands.
Yes, or it can be myriads upon myriads, or thousands times 10,000s. Yes, yeah. So how has the tone changed? We talked about the tone of the beasts are coming out of the sea. It's terror, right? What is it now?
Majesty. Well, God is there. And
Majesty.
People are ministering.
Yes, the awe, the reverence, the majesty, right? And what happens at the end of verse 10?
Judgment was sitting. Books were open.
Books are opened because why? What is it now? Judgment. Now it's a court, right? The court is seated and the books are open because now it's a judgment seat. What judgment is made? Verse 11.
The beast is slain and body destroyed.
Yeah, that
over.
fourth beast.
And give it to the burning bush. It's over.
The fourth beast is all his power is taken from him. He is slain and destroyed, and the first 3 beasts are stripped of their power. Right? And they live on for a time. Now, that the chronology is not sensible, right? Because this is a vision and we expect that sort of thing. It's just like when the tree is suddenly taken away the mind of the man and he was a tree and now he's a man turned an animal, turned a man again, right? This is what happens in visions. We have these disconnects, but what we have is that some kingdoms, they will be allowed a time to live on, right? That we have to live through that process. So we see the author of Daniel portraying Antiochus IV as the little horn, the evil tyrant who makes war against the holy ones, in order to express the hope that God will make his judgment, intervene in history to put an end to a brutal regime, right? The apocalypse prayer is that God's everlasting kingdom will replace this beastly one, right? And that's what we're seeing happening here. Someone read for us Daniel 8:13 through 14.
While I was thinking about the horns, oh wait, am I right?
Daniel 8.
Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled?
Let's pause.
Not
I'm
8.
sorry, I said 8 and I really meant 7.
So I was reading the right.
You go, it should start in my vision at night.
Oh, okay.
So sorry.
In my vision. 8 through 13.
13 through 14.
Got it.
7.
I'm gonna
Y'all, I put 8 in so many places.
While
My
I
notes.
was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. The horn had eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth that spoke with
I'm so sorry. I think I must have it wrong again. Let me just do the passage I mean. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, sovereign power. All peoples and nations and men of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I'm so sorry, Sharon. Okay, so this expression, who's coming on scene? Okay, you're jumping ahead though. I do think we are going to land on Jesus, the Son of Man, okay? Because if you are a reader prior to the first century, you don't know Jesus, right? And so what is this character? Let's think about this character. I'm okay, jumping with Jesus is not bad, but one like a son of man. All right, this word son of man is used often in the Old Testament, or, its Hebrew equivalent to this Aramaic, and it often means a human person. Adam is a son of, we have this idea of Adam, yeah. And here's some examples. Ezekiel 3:7, the word of the Lord comes to Ezekiel saying, son of man, talking to Ezekiel, right? I have made you a watchman for the house of Israel. In our next chapter, chapter 8, the angel Gabriel will say to Daniel, son of man, understand that the vision concerns the end. Okay, so he's talking to him. He's just saying human person, right? Psalm 8, what is man that you are mindful of him? Son of man, that you care for him, right? That's talking about a human person. This is a way of saying a person, a being, a human being, right? So what does it mean that here we have one like a son of man?
A human form, maybe?
Maybe a human form?
Because he's coming from the clouds of heaven.
Okay, so he's like a human being, but he's more. Remember, the beasts were like this animal, that animal, but there was more to them, right? So these were figures that were beyond the animal that we like. And here we see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven. Who usually rides the clouds?
Angels and gods.
God, all the way through the Psalms, right? Psalm 104:3, he makes the clouds his chariot and rides on the wings of the wind. Psalm 68:4, extol him who rides on the clouds. His name is the Lord. So is this one like a son of man, only a human being? He's more, right? He's maybe the form of a human person, but he is a heavenly being. And what does he do? He comes in and then what? He approaches the Ancient of Days, right? The myriads and myriads upon myriads are attending the Ancient of Days, but he approaches. He's more royal than the myriads. And he is given what?
Authority.
It says they bring him near to. So
Near to the Ancient of Days, given authority, power, and sovereign power. We've seen some beings in Daniel being given authority and sovereign power so far. Who have we seen? I mean, God said he gave that to Nebuchadnezzar even, right? He said, I'm the one who set you up with authority, but they misused it and it was taken from them. And now it's being given to this one like a son of man. And what happens next with all these peoples, nations, and men of every language?
they serve him.
They worship him. Do you remember in the fiery furnace chapter? All the peoples and nations and men of every language were supposed to worship. What did Nebuchadnezzar want them to worship? The three friends. His great statue of gold that he set up, right? So that's not who people are supposed to worship. Instead, they are supposed to worship here this divine being, right? Darius even just sent this out as a decree after Daniel was saved from the lion's den. All the peoples and nations, they should reverence and awe the Most High, right? His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. So if you are a few couple, if this is written in like the 160s, or a few if it's written earlier, centuries BC, this is a mysterious figure, right? And let's look at one more element of the mystery, okay? We saw the one like a son of man was given a dominion, but look at 7:18. The saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever, yes, forever and ever. Who's given dominion? Who's given the kingdom? The saints. Not the one, but the plural, right? Verse 27 again. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the holy people, saints. Those are equivalent translations, the people of the Most High. And his kingdom, the Most High's kingdom, will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. So what we have, the king who will reign, seems to be both the people of God, somehow representing God and God's kingdom, and this figure of the Son of Man. And so Israel, as they're reading this, prior to the first century, Israel sees that they, the people of God, will eventually receive the kingdom from God. And also, at the same time, overlapping, that a representative human person, one like a human person, will receive the kingdom of God. And those are somehow the same thing, right? The conclusion of Daniel's terrifying vision and the suffering he sees under the reign of the monstrous beast is that eventually the people will be rescued, right? They'll be delivered from the tyrant. We also see they'll be exalted to do the work God has always wanted people to do, to reign as his representatives in his way. And how can God's people ever do that? From our side of the first century, we have the revelation. It becomes so much clearer why Jesus used this term for himself, right? He is of Israel. He is the human person, yet he is the divine person who deserves worship. You don't only worship the Most High, and yet this one like a son of man is worshiped by every people, language, and nation, right? And so Jesus, we see him before the high priest in his trial in Mark 14, saying, the high priest says to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am." That great statement that echoes the holy name of God, I am that I am. I'm not contingent. I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Right? Jesus echoes this scene because Jesus is the human one and also divine, and he represents out of Israel and then out of all the nations, he represents all the saints of the Most High. So we get to be a part of that as the new Israel, as the people of the Most High, humans, but also indwelled with the divine Ruach, the Spirit of God. And we see that just like this beast is slain, Jesus is slain, but then he is raised, he ascends on the clouds of heaven, and he's exalted to kingship. And even though, as Hebrews 2 says, we don't yet see everything under his feet, we will. And Daniel is assuring us it will happen. The kingdom has been given to him, and though the beasts are allowed to live on for a time, he will have dominion. The oppressive regimes of the world will be replaced by the eternal, good, light, holy reign of God. So that, that we're seeing the arc of this vision as it comes around from the chaos and violence into this figure that has and will reign forever. Questions or comments on this chapter?
I think with hindsight, it's just like we sit there and go, oh, that's Jesus, and oh, he should be worshipped and all. But if I was back in Daniel's time, I would be looking at this a whole different way. That this is, because we've been talking about kingdoms, and you can, almost know that this is somebody's kingdom. And so when they're talking about somebody coming, I'm thinking, okay, so this is a new kingdom that's going to take over and get rid of the Greeks and all those other people. But then I'm also sitting there thinking, but it's telling us that we're supposed to be able to worship this new Son of Man, but everything that Moses and everything said, there's one God. So to me, I'd be just, my mind would be blown.
This is you've captured that very well. This is a mystery to the rabbinic scholars, even in Jesus' day. By the time of Jesus' day, this passage is considered a messianic passage. It is considered to be describing the one who's come. Now, when the Maccabees were able to rise up and defeat and take back control of Israel, that was considered a fulfillment. When the saints are going to be given power, that was considered a fulfillment of this time. But what we see is that times repeat, don't they? There's wars and rumors of wars, and kingdoms rise from the great chaos sea, and we still have it happening today, right? And so Jesus talked about fulfillment from some things in Daniel immediately, sort of referring to kind of we believe he's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, but he also talked about it in fulfilling the end of all earthly kingdoms. And so that's where we're going as we continue in Daniel, is into we started back with Belshazzar. Why start back with Belshazzar? Why restart our timeline? Because we're back to the beginning of the end of the Babylonian kingdom. And as we look forward to the end of these earthly kingdoms, we have an eye towards the end of all earthly kingdoms, the end of all evil, oppressive regimes, the end of any king who sets himself up against God. And we'll continue in that in 2 weeks when we have our lesson over chapter 8. Thank you.
So Deanna, I was just gonna say, when you mentioned you're off with the lessons and stuff, that call your first lesson introduction, and then you can go on, and you won't get confused.
Thank
So
you.
there's my input for that. Get you a little organized there.
Just what I need.
Well, thank you, Deanna. Who knew that the Old Testament could be so interesting, and full of nuance and everything else. Are there any particular announcements for today? Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
Any announcements?
Oh.
Announcements for today?
Do we know anything about Vanessa?
She was on there a while ago.
Oh, yeah, but we didn't